he said, to combat the animal menace, many different cultures and leaders around the world, not just in Atlantis, which for him at that time was a continent that stretched the entire mid-Atlantic ridge, basically, was the continent at that time of Atlantis. And Casey said, world leaders got together. They sent out a broadcast, so suggesting they have wireless communication or radio. They all met each other in flying machines, primitive at this time. He says they were made from the hides of stretched elephants.
I'd like to welcome to the show Michael Le Flem. How you doing, Michael?
How you doing, Alex?
I'm good, man. I'm good. Thank you so much for coming on the show, man. We are going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, the lost city of Atlantis, which is legendary to say the least. And I've had a few people on the show talk about it from a channeling perspective, which is something I've always liked. Well, if you have a channel, hey, man, who built the pyramids? Hey, can you tell us about that kind of stuff? And it's been a fascinating, those episodes have been fascinating. But your work is really interesting on Atlantis and your perspective of how you did research and how you kind of came along to where you are right now. So first question to you, man, is what got you interested in Atlantis?
You know, it's people always ask me, and I wish I had a good answer. I think, you know, I'm a history professor. That's my day job. And I must have just run across it in teaching ancient history survey courses and things like this, where, you know, if you have a textbook or just a survey book, you're going to run up against when did civilization begin, you know? And of course, you know, I had a little bit more leeway because I wasn't tenure track, you know, I was just the adjunct gun for hire, MA, as you see. So I could take a little bit more liberty because I didn't have somebody from the faculty kind of watching over my shoulder. And so I would teach, for example, Graham Hancock books, you know, in my ancient history class. I would assign,
get out of here.
No, I did. And, you know, I would call the bookstore and say, you have to order 50 copies of Magicians of the Gods or Fingerprints of the Gods. And I wouldn't tell them anything. I would, because
it just say, looks like a history book. Yeah, no one's going to read it.
Here's your reading, read chapter 1. And then, you know, look at their expressions and they'd say, you know, to my great surprise, they wouldn't actually complain. They'd be like, oh, I haven't heard this before, but that makes perfect sense, you know? And I kind of workshopped it with them for years, just kind of over the course of a couple semesters. And then I really started getting into remote viewing and things like what Dean Radin was studying at the, you know, Noetics Institute. And then I started reading actual books on remote viewing from like people like Pat Price or I believe it's like Lynn Buchanan. And, you know, I was a pretty materialist based person myself, just kind of aware of spiritual traditions and channeling, but never really aware of the extent to which, you know, people could do this accurately and how it was used by the DIA, the CIA. And, you know, inevitably that led me to people like Edgar Cayce or Frederick Spencer Oliver, who was a really important source because very few people had ever talked about this kid from the 1800s who wrote a book about my life in 11,160 BC. And so I took all of my own training as, you know, a historian who studies the history of philosophy mainly. And, you know, partly the first quarter of the book is that it's like, this is the history of how this story has been accounted for and discussed in antiquity across different cultures, pre-Platonic sources, Egyptian sources, and then of course an unpacking of like Plato's two dialogues. But then it switches into, well, here's a chronology of the first time this was really ever channeled, you know, because a lot of people, when they talk about channeled sources, they just focus on, say, modern sources or Edgar Cayce, who are incredibly important. But I wanted to see as a historian, like, when was the first channeled account of this story? And it turned out to be really one of the most bizarre and almost impossible to explain at face value, unless it indeed was a truly channeled account. Because what Frederick Oliver said And just a little background, he's a 17-year-old kid living in the Wild West in 1882, 1886, on 1886 on the frontier, the closing of the frontier in Eureka, California, next to Mount Shasta.
Oh. Okay.
And he suddenly starts hearing this voice in his head that basically says, I'm an occult adept. My name is Philos. I need you to tell my story of my past life in Atlantis in the year 11,160 BC. And this kid over 3 years comes home, and not in a trance in waking life, but in a kind of intense focus, starts automatically writing. Sometimes he says backwards, sometimes forwards, different chapters, different pages, out of order. A 400 roughly page book that is to me, the most compelling account of Atlantis I've ever read in my life. And it's astounding because the things he's talking about in this book did not exist in 1882 or 1886. He's talking about holographic smartphones. He's talking about video surveillance technology. He's talking about craft that can go underwater, in the air, in the high stratosphere, that are made of aluminum and cigar shaped before flight existed. And then he has an internal physics, an internal chemistry, and a historical explanation of the final 5 centuries of the Atlantean timeline that almost exactly corroborate and support what Plato said. But this was a kid who had never read any of the classics. He was uneducated by his own admission and by testimonies of his friends. He was just a kid who was a miner, worked with his dad in a silver mine.
There wasn't a lot of copies of Plato's dialogues running around in the old Wild Wild West?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
That wasn't easy reading back then.
No. And by his own admission, he said, I was a lazy student. I was a kind of an idiot. I don't know anything about this when I'm not in this kind of clairaudient trance. And he even said, I didn't even want to do this because I lost a lot of friends. My parents thought I was going crazy, but here it is. And that book has been out, and also I should add, that book was finished in 1889, roughly, is when he claims he finished it. And he died young in 1899, around the age of 33. He actually died. And that book was never published in his own lifetime. His mother kept it in a drawer because it was just handwritten notes. And she actually didn't publish it until 1905. And then it got picked up by a kind of bigger publisher in like 1920, which is when people started reading it. So when people say, well, he just did it to be sensational, it's like he lost friends. His parents thought he was going crazy, and he never published it. And it's impossible that he could have just been copying from later channelers, because he was the first one to do it.
Yes, so before Edgar Cayce.
This is before Edgar Cayce.
Dolores
this is
Claiborne,
before Edgar Cayce. All of these people, and that. So I wanted to show people, because I was a skeptic. I didn't go into this book trying to prove the historical reality of Atlantis. I actually just did a 7-year investigation and said, if I find evidence for or against, I'm just going to lay it out. And to my great surprise, even though I don't give any kind of conclusion or suggestion of what you should think, I'm pretty neutral. And, the reviews have always been very complimentary on, I appreciate that you don't tell me what to think. You just show me the evidence. But it's astounding, Alex, the level of detail in this book, A Dweller on Two Planets. That's what the book was later titled, or he titled it that, I think, in the first preface. But that's what the book is called, A Dweller on Two Planets. And it's amazing because when Cayce started channeling about Atlantis, about 40 years, 50 years really after this book was first dictated in the Wild West, it's unbelievable because Cayce, who had never read the book, is corroborating many of the dates, facts, technology of this civilization. So for that reason, I really wanted to, take a book that was just going to be kind of like a intellectual history of the discussion, and really now make it a book about how I can corroborate clairvoyant sources with archaeology, geology, myths from different cultures and things like linguistic similarities that shouldn't be there, and really show people not only that there's a lot of evidence for this civilization, but that there's a lot of unexplained things that channelers have said that just cannot be written off.
Well, let me ask you this. I'd love to hear your point of it, because I mean, obviously I have a lot of channels on the show. And I've been fascinated with channels for most of my life. I found Edgar Casey and even some yogis that I've studied talk about this kind of stuff as well. What is your, from a historian's point of view, and I'm assuming you've become a little less material based.
Oh, I had to
after all of this.
Yeah.
What's your take on channeling and the information that, like you said, can't really be ignored as much as they want to ignore it?
Right.
They can't be ignored anymore.
Right. You know, there was a guy who read my book who suggested a book after I had published mine called this, I believe it's called The Secret Vaults of History, by an author named Schwartz, I believe. And in that book, there's a Polish channel from World War II who was actually executed by the Nazis. And his name was Osiewiecki, I believe, Stefan Osiewiecki. And people don't really talk about him, but in that book, it's fascinating because the author shows that some of the most renowned scientists and, you know, political figures from Europe discovered this guy, and before the war would gather in his house, and like archaeologists would come, anthropologists would come, and they would give him like an artifact that they knew the history of, you know, so an artifact from, say, the Bronze Age or something. And this is a guy who didn't know anything about this. He would go into a kind of semi-waking trance, and he would pinpoint to the century and the culture what this object was. And in fact, he would even tell you, like, this is what I'm seeing at the time. This object existed at that time. And you know, when you see things like that, and it was studied, it was in a controlled experiment with, and done 50 times by university professors, witnessed this. Similar with Casey, you know, I really tried to show people it wasn't just word of mouth. These are 14,000 transcripts still contained in the, you know, ARE library. And as I show in the book, Harvard, Stanford, Princeton all sent professors to debunk Edgar Casey's medical readings that could not do it. They couldn't do it because they witnessed him diagnosing people, you know, with spinal injuries or different endocrinological problems that he could not have known. He's not a medical doctor. And yet when the real doctor investigated, they're like, that's exactly where the fracture in the dorsal lumbar is. And how do you know any of this? They thought he was memorizing from almanacs and things like this. So it is real. I just think it's incredibly difficult to convince somebody who's stuck in like a very materialistic Western modern paradigm, because we generally, outside of, say, quantum physics is probably the closest most people can come to non-material, non-locality. But it's like, to me, if you can get your mind around the, you know, wave particle theory, why is it difficult to think that, you know, this is that strange? Like we know that's true. So shouldn't that have greater implications? If like particles have essentially consciousness or awareness, that's not strange enough for you. You know, why couldn't people be accessing what Edgar Casey called like the super conscious mind, the oversoul, the Akashic records, the cloud computing database of the world? Why is that so strange? You know?
Well, it's because those particles don't have a face and don't have a religion attached to them.
Well, there you go.
And people are just, when they're so stuck to what they've been programmed to, if you take one, it's like a Jenga puzzle. You pull one thing out, it starts to shake the foundation a bit, and they don't like it.
No, and you know, I'm really glad you said that, because I always tell people, I think even in the book I mentioned in the epilogue, you know, as we were joking before the show, you know, I went to Catholic school, and even though my parents were not, you know, they didn't care what I believed, but I, on my own, just from being in that world for 16 years almost, you know, I believed some aspects of Orthodox Christianity for a long time. And then I went to college and I studied Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam. And I was like, had a nervous breakdown because my whole worldview was shattered. Then I went to graduate school and studied the history of the Enlightenment and atheism. And I became a hardcore, Friedrich Nietzsche book on my shoulder everywhere I went. And then I got into this, got in a few fights at bars with people. Then I got to this and I was like, wait a minute. Like now I got to go back, not all the way, but I have to scale back the existentialist materialist view because now I'm being presented with evidence, just like an investigator, this contradicting my materialistic worldview. And so this book for me was really like a personal investigation that I wanted to then share with the world because it changed me and it led to a lot of really cool new discoveries about not just channeling, but the subject of Atlantis,
So what is the most significant historical record or source that mentions Atlantis? Would it be this kid?
Well, channeled source, I would say absolutely. A Dweller on Two Planets to me, along with the, of Casey's 14,000 general readings, 500 roughly were on Atlantis, and those are invaluable. And thank God, there was a searchable Edgar Casey archive at the time where you could actually enter search terms instead of, literally reading through 5 or 14,000 transcripts. So I was able to read all 5. I was able to, first of all, find, because they're not collated. I was able to find all 500 Edgar Casey readings, read them all, and then over a year almost put together like his story of all the characters and the timeline, and then kind of superimpose his idea over Frederick Oliver's ideas and see where they line up, and then put Plato on top of that. And it was almost like a perfect alignment, which is statistically impossible. I'm going to be honest with you. Sure. But as far as historical sources, I would say, Plato's is the most famous one. And as I mentioned in the first chapter of the book, it's not the only one. It's not even the only one in ancient Greece. It's just we don't have a full record of, say, Hellanicus's book, Atlantis, or Solon wrote a poem called Atlantis that's been lost. Really? Yeah. And also, recall that the Library of Alexandria and the Serapeum were destroyed 3 times and looted by the Vatican. So it's like, we don't even have probably 0.1% of the ancient texts, But another one that's fascinating is the Egyptian, the Turin King Papyrus, or the King's List, the Turin King's List, which itself talks about the reign of the demigods and the gods. And that reign, the demigods, I believe, reign ends around 9,800 BC, which is almost 9,600 BC timeline in Plato's account, which he also got from Solon, who got it from Egypt. So it's like the Atlantean story goes back to Egypt. That's its origin point. Plato was just transmitting it to a Greek audience through Solon. And it's fascinating that an uneducated man from Hopkinsville, Kentucky, who had never read anything like this, said the Atlanteans went to Egypt, to the Yucatan, and to the Pyrenees Mountains, where the Basque country is. And they did that around 10,500 BC. And they built the pyramids at that time, and they rebooted Atlantean culture. And it's like, well, that's kind of exactly what Plato said. So we should probably pay a little bit more attention to these sources,
So Plato was pretty on point then, from what you're saying.
Yeah, and I always tell people, according to Edgar Casey, he doesn't go into too much detail about the origins, like the absolute beginnings of Atlantis, because in his readings, the first political event or the first, should I say, like development in this culture, which, would be the first destruction, which was the result of a technological disaster, misapplication. He puts that at 50,722 BC. And he says at that time, the world was being overrun by what he calls the animal menace, which again, that's real. That's the megafauna. That's the saber-toothed tigers, the mammoths, the, you know, Haast's eagles that were flying around up to 1,000 years ago. There was still those eagles that could eat people, creatures in the sea. And he said, Edgar Cayce on a couch in 1932, not being an anthropologist or an evolutionary biologist, he said, to combat the animal menace, many different cultures and leaders around the world, not just in Atlantis, which for him at that time was a continent that stretched the entire mid-Atlantic ridge, basically was the continent at that time of Atlantis. And Cayce said, world leaders got together. They sent out a broadcast, so suggesting they have wireless communication or radio. They all met each other in flying machines, primitive at this time. He says they were made from the hides of stretched elephants and filled with gas and powered by a combination of entraining with a crystal device and push-pull from a gas. So basically like a balloon that was guided along a pathway, which again is an extremely strange thing to say, because Plato himself said there were a lot of elephants on the island of Atlantis. In a close read of that text, Plato says that. So it's interesting Cayce said that. And they met and they decided, we're going to use a directed energy weapon, which he's not clear. It was either beamed, he just says from the stratosphere. So you must assume it was, you know, orbital or some sort of device that maybe was like HARP pinged off the stratosphere. It's not clear, because he's again saying this in 1932 from his couch in a trance. So Cayce says this technology was deployed, and the plan was to send a directed energy beam into volcanic openings around the Earth in the hopes of destroying the food supply of certain megafaunal populations, because they just couldn't deal with these animals overrunning the Earth. Even though they had advanced cities and everything, it was just becoming inconvenient for them. And he said that precipitated the first breakup of the continent of Atlantis around 50,000 BC. And he said at the same time, there was a magnetic pole shift naturally taking place that was exacerbated by this. And he said after that point, the continent became 5 islands. And then there was a second destruction in 28,000 BC. What happened in the intervening 22,000 years, I don't claim to know. And after the second destruction, now it's 3 islands. And so that's the story Plato's telling, is the third final iteration of Atlantis, where it's basically 3 large islands centered around the Azores from Plato's description and from Cayce's description. And so that's why it's kind of a complicated story, is because it used to be a continent, then it was 5 islands, then it was 3. And that's why when people say, well, you know, what are you talking about? This pyramid off the coast of Cuba has anything to do with Atlantis? And it's like, well, perhaps that's from an earlier time, you know, or what are you talking about? There's, remnants of Atlantis in Egypt. You're suggesting the pyramid, you know, that's not where Plato said it was. Well, it's like in Plato's account, it's a large island outside of the Straits of Gibraltar that had colonies all through the Mediterranean and had already mapped the continent, he says. So he's referring to the Americas. So Plato was aware of the Americas in 360 BC.
And then where does Antarctica play into any of this? Because now there's
in my research, I actually don't talk about the Antarctic connection at all, because other people have already written books on that. But it's entirely possible. The only time I mention Antarctica in the book is how in the Piri Reis map from 1513, there's a map of Antarctica without the ice. And Charles Hapgood sent that map to the Air Force in the 60s and said, can you explain this? And their answer, I put it in the book, they said, this is accurate to like the same degree as our survey that we did in the 20th century, but that's impossible given the knowledge of, you know, Renaissance Turkey. That's impossible that this could be done. Where did you get this, Mr. Hapgood? Like, we've never seen this map before. So I don't know. I think it's very possible, because look, if this was a civilization that, in Edgar Casey's description, basically lasted 40,000 years. Okay.
Jesus.
40,000 years over God knows how many different iterations, languages, cultures, peoples. Although he says that the people that became the Iroquois tribe in North America were the original settlers of Atlantis at its beginnings.
Generationally.
Generationally, yeah. Like the original race was actually Native American in possession of this high technology. And so, you know, if you had a culture that could do these things, and that in Frederick Oliver's account became more advanced than us on a level of basically Star Wars, right before its final destruction, about 1,000 years before it declined into the kind of Bronze Age chariot and sailing vessel story that Plato tells, Frederick Oliver has an addendum where he says, we reached a level of technology that, I mean, he's describing Star Wars. That's what he's talking about. I'm on a flying craft talking to a princess through a holographic projector. Mm-hmm. In 1886, he's saying this, mm-hmm. before the franchise was invented. And, you know, in Oliver's account, that high technology kind of went by the wayside for the final 500 to 800 years because the leadership, he said, had become as electricity, which perhaps is his explanation of transhumanism or AI or something. And he said the leadership basically checked out and left humanity on the final island of Poseid, the capital island. They left them to their own devices, and they devolved into basically the state that Plato would have been describing, which is chariots, fighting with spears, sailing in boats, you know, because most people that have a problem with the Atlantis story, they have a problem with the high technology. Like they can wrap their mind around, okay, maybe there was an island, circular city on an island that fought with Greek technology. We get that. That's weird, but we can wrap our minds around that.
We've seen Indiana Jones. We can maybe.
Right. But where's all this Star Wars stuff coming from? And most people think that's a, you know, post Star Wars franchise or post modern age, like retrospective projection onto Plato's story. And that's why A Dweller on Two Planets was such a critical source, because he explains the high technology. It's a critical source in two ways, because he's describing technology that didn't exist anywhere on Earth in 1886. That's source number one. But number two, he's describing where that went and how the civilization descended by 10,000 BC into the civilization that was recorded by the Egyptians, who inherited that story and passed to Plato, which makes more sense, actually. So it was interesting because it was so many different, you know, is it an island? Is it a continent? What's the timeline? And I would say, look, just like I said, it was a global civilization that had its center in the mid-Atlantic, wink, ocean, whose namesake we've still used to this day. I went to Florida Atlantic University. You know, there is no etymological explanation for that word. And over time was whittled down to these 5, then 3 islands. And that's the story Plato would have been telling. So according to, it was Casey, I think you said that there was this iteration, this 5 island, or this continent down to 5 island, down to 3 island thing, that we kind of basically went from the beginnings, which is not, there's not a lot of talk or any story about the origins of like how they where they come from. Tell me. Well, yeah, that's a really interesting. Somebody once asked Edgar Casey, and again, it's such a shame that there weren't trained anthropologists and historians. They were just mainly Christian housewives and their husbands.
You're right.
Who were like, hey, Mr. Casey, when did humanity begin? Like, I mean, it's like the greatest loss to the world. Thank God one day somebody straight up asked him, like, hey, when we use the directed energy weapon, like what date was that? And then he just shoots out with 50,722. Which, before I answer your question, to give you an example of, I think, why this book has, you know, really been like successful with people on the fence about this is because I just wanted to see. It's like, okay, Casey says there was a, weapon used against the megafauna and it was successful, but it blew up the continent. Is there any evidence of that, of a megafaunal extinction in 50,000 BC? Well, I looked through the Journal of Quaternary Studies. They have an unknown megafaunal extinction at 50,000 BC, roughly, give or take 100 years, that we can't explain, that they say it shouldn't really exist because there weren't enough people to hunt these animals. So we can attribute it probably to climate change. So they admitted that both of the things he said were true. There was a climactic shift at 50,000 BC, and there was a megafaunal extinction. And it's like, that was unknown even to professionals in that field in 1932, let alone a guy in a trance on a couch in Virginia Beach.
Well, before you get to that other answer, because I've studied the Vedic texts a lot, and
Sure.
and Hinduism and where that, a lot of their original stories in the Bhagavad Gita in general.
Sure.
Because they're the oldest, quote unquote,
right,
culture and religion, organized situation that we have on the planet today.
Correct.
The Bhagavad Gita is talking a lot about things that Casey kind of talked about with Atlantis, with flying machines, energy weapons, things like that. In your study, have you connected the Bhagavad Gita stories or things in the Vedic texts or traditions into where we're at now with Atlantis?
I have. In fact, in the pre-Platonic sources in the beginning of the book, I mentioned in the Mahabharata, they mention a place called Atala, and they situate it at the same latitude as the Canary Islands, So it's like, and they say it was, destroyed after a 10-year war, and it sunk into the Western Ocean. And that predates Plato. And it's not an Egyptian source, And I mean, in the section, I think in chapter 4, I talk about what you were mentioning, like the technologies in some of these texts, like Vimanas, energy weapons, perhaps nuclear, or some sort of extremely powerful energy source that destroyed perhaps different cities. And it is amazing because, like, first of all, I mean, Oppenheimer himself said this.
Yeah.
And again, I always tell people to think, it's like, it's fine if you want to say you're smarter than me, who the hell am I? But to suggest that you know better than Plato and Oppenheimer and Albert Einstein, by the way, Albert Einstein vouched for everything Charles Hapgood wrote. Okay. Albert Einstein used to write letters of recommendation for his Earth crust shift theory and his ancient maps. Okay. So even Einstein was on board with this. And so it's fascinating because, like you said, Oppenheimer, some people suggest he even got the idea conceptually from this ancient text, and he was asked, and I haven't been able to verify this like 100%, which drives me crazy, but I think there is very good anecdotal evidence that during a Q&A after the dropping of the atomic bomb at Rochester University, allegedly a student asked him, was this the first time we've ever done this? What we just saw on, heard on the radio and saw pictures of in the newspaper. Was this the first time? And he said, well, and he paused. He said, well, in modern times, yes.
Well, I just found
what's
out,
that all?
Well, I found out in my research that scientists have discovered in places in India where they said that some of these battles supposedly took place,
right,
that they are finding radiation in the land that has no explanation, meaning that there's no natural source of the radiation, nor has there ever been a battle in recorded history in that area that would have radiation.
Right.
But yet there's still radiation in those areas, hence where these quote unquote energy weapons were shot.
Right. And, in Frederick Oliver's account, it's really weird because, again, a 17-year-old kid working in a mine in Eureka is not reading the Bhagavad Gita, I'm guessing. in 1886.
In between the dialogues of Plato, he's just snuck in the Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah. After he comes out of the silver mine, he goes home and has a glass of milk.
Curls up with the Bhagavad Gita.
Curls up with the Bhagavad Gita. Yeah, on the frontier in 1886.
Right.
He says, like in the story that he channels from 11,160 BC, the story of this man, this voice who's telling him, I'm using you as a channel. One of the plot arcs is this person who's called Zaim, Zailm is the name of the protagonist in this story, this incredible, beautiful, like it's a Star Wars story. It's crazy. I'm almost convinced Lucas and friends must have heard of this book. I'm really serious about that.
Sure.
I'm very serious about this because there's too many things that you can't explain. But in the story, the character he becomes a prince. He's a miner who strikes gold. He becomes a prince and runs up the ranks of Atlantean society. And he's actually sent to India, which he calls Suern, Suern, in 11,160 on a diplomatic mission in a flying machine. And, he goes over there and says that they had an extremely advanced civilization, but it was different. It was more of like they had reached a point, he said, where they didn't need material weapons of war like the Atlanteans did. So he said, he describes a war between Atlantis and India, basically. And he says that we sent our flying ships there to attack them with weapons, and their occult leaders could just turn the weapons against us. And he's describing guided missiles in 1886.
Right. But
and he's like, they could turn the missiles against us and destroyed our Veil fleet. He even has a name for it. And in the Vedic text, they talk about Veliksi. And again, it's like, where is this kid getting these things? He's not reading Sanskrit text.
And also that makes sense because, I mean, as a country and as a culture, India has always been based much more in the spiritual,
right,
and in the consciousness aspect of things, which could be a remnants from an advanced culture,
right,
from 10,000, 20, 30,000 years ago in that area, which was evolved consciously. And there are stories about that as well, where they've evolved so much that the yogic powers, but on a massive scale, of being able to manipulate reality, which is stuff that the yogic powers do on a smaller scale. But can you imagine 20,000 years of that?
Well, and it's crazy because the king of Atlantis, or of Poseid, one of the three islands, which again is odd because Casey said Poseid for the main island. Oliver said Poseid. And then in Plato's account of Atlantis, there's a statue of Poseidon in the capital. So I think they're all talking about the island of Poseid, one of three final islands. But in the story, it's interesting because the king of Poseid tells Zaim, be very careful how you deal with this Indian king, because he can kill even me with just a thought halfway across the world. So be very careful. Like, don't think that there's anything with your weaponry and your ship and all of your by the way, your electric rifle. So he's describing a blaster, I'm guessing. I mean, what is an electric rifle in 1886? It's like he's talking about a blaster rifle.
Is electricity a thing yet? Oh, a little bit. No,
it is.
Is it?
It is. Yeah, it is. But it's like the light bulb had been invented in households like 4 years. No, like the year he started writing it, the first light bulb, I think, from Edison patented.
Yeah, so
was in a house. Right. He doesn't have electricity in his house. No, definitely.
Yeah, it's not widely known what electricity is or what it does yet at that point.
No.
It's right around the same
Neither
time.
are smartphones that can project images holographically.
Yeah.
Neither are, like
ships, cigar ships,
cigar-shaped flying ships made of aluminum, and then descriptions of how they could transmute clay in Atlantis into aluminum, and then a 3-page treatise on how that worked. And it's like, where are you getting this? Probably from an actual source from the Akashic records or the cloud that actually found somebody that was, able to be used as a vehicle to channel this message. Yeah,
And again, it's speaking of the
knows?
Akashic records, this is something that the Vedic texts have talked about for thousands of years before.
Well, and I always tell people, like, Casey never read, according to any reliable source, anything in Sanskrit or anything remotely involving ancient India. He was a Sunday school teacher who had a 6th grade education and was essentially ignorant in waking life. And yet, when he was asked, like, how are you getting the source? He says, from the Akashic records. And then look in a Sanskrit dictionary. What does that word mean in Sanskrit? Akasha. It means ether. And I always tell people, like, what are we using right now to, have this interview? We're using the Ethernet. Like, why is it hard to think that the universe doesn't have a stronger Ethernet called Akasha, which means ether in Sanskrit, and that some people can tap into? That's what Tesla said when people said, how are you coming up with all this? He said, my mind is merely a receiver. That's it.
Well, and would you agree that Da Vinci was also a channel?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, the stuff that he was writing down in the 15th century.
Absolutely.
I mean,
absolutely. Nostradamus, Da Vinci, all of these people were probably doing the same thing, just in different times. And, but yeah, Da Vinci probably was looked at as like an alien or something. Like, how are you coming up with it? Like a helicopter? What is it?
And they actually, where was it? I think it was it's either in the Vedic text. I think there was design for a flying machine in the Vedic text.
Sure. Yeah, Vimanas.
And they actually built it based on it I don't know if it was at Berkeley or MIT. Somebody built the damn thing. Not wide, not a life size, but a small version based on it, and it worked.
Well, it's always been fascinating to me because I believe it's one called the Vimana Sastra, which was revealed to be not a complete hoax, but like an extremely shaky source. That if it wasn't like planted as a hoax, it was definitely like somebody wrote it in probably early 1910s or 20s and said it was ancient, Sanskrit. And it was reviewed in the 60s, and somebody said, actually, this is not an authentic. But then the ones that have not been debunked, my favorite word, the ones that talk about like when you get into the Vimana, this is how you start the Mercury engine. And it's like, why would there be a manual for a flying machine in a temple in Sanskrit if they didn't have a need for that? Like there's no need for the manual in a myth. If it's a myth, just like when people say, well, Plato's dialogues, in the Timaeus and the Critias, the Atlantis parts of those are myth. And I say, okay, that's interesting, because the first thing he says is, although this story may sound strange, Socrates, every word of it was true, and it's vouched for by Solon, the wisest of the 7 sages. So he disclaims it's not a myth. And then if it were a myth, why would you need to describe like the stadia length of the canals? Why would you need that? If it's a myth, you don't see the details like that. It's like he's describing a historical story. He tells you it's a historically true story. Solon was a real person who did visit Egypt, and it's like, why are we debating what Plato said? Oh, because we've written hundreds of thousands of articles and textbooks already that say that humanity was in a hunter-gathering state.
Oh, don't get me started. Yeah,
doing nothing with their, walking on 4 legs in the, savannas, and it's like, no,
and also constructing Göbekli Tepe.
You're right.
Exactly. Exactly.
Hunting, gathering, moving megalithic objects, no big deal.
Carving things in with astronomical accuracy. Sure, that makes all the sense in the world. Like, you come on. Like, and I think now, though, even with conversations like this that are hitting the ether, people are starting to just wake up and go, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense anymore. Even though you've been feeding us this for so many years, we're starting to think for ourselves here and just go, look, the evidence doesn't make sense. That's where people like Graham Hancock are such a blessing, because at least he might not be right, but he's asking the questions as an
Well, and
investigator.
that's all I do in the book, you know, and I think that's why it has been so successful. Is I always loved that Hancock and the people that came, you know, before me in this field, the best ones never told you what to think. They just said, look,
This is what we found.
how is there a map from 1513 that we found in a dusty palace in Istanbul that has a map of Antarctica before it was ever discovered? Just alone, how do you explain that on its surface? You know,
Right.
how do you explain, like you said, Gobekli Tepe, you know, which isn't a myth, it's a archaeological site that we know was at least, you know, around 10,000 BC. It's like, how do you describe that in the current paradigm of hunter-gathering? But as I spend like a whole chapter on this exact problem, and I bring up Gobekli Tepe because that really bothered me as a historian. Like, why aren't we updating textbooks? Why isn't there a ancient history, you know, like prelude, like I used to teach, you know, for the first month? I would just teach these types of things. Like, what do you think about this? What do you think about, you know, evidence of a comet strike from James Kennett's research? What do you think about that? That's not channeled. What do you think about this? What do you think about the CIA and the DIA using channelers and then documenting their accuracy, you know, and then sending the FBI, yes, exactly, sending the FBI to, I believe, Ingo Swann's house when he discovered a secret program that he wasn't supposed to know about, you know? So it's like the government knows this is real. It's just very difficult to replicate. You know, only a handful of people can do it well. Just like a handful of channels had the opportunity in time to not be influenced by, say, Star Wars or the works of, you know, Graham Hancock. Because again, I wanted to show people, you can't just say this kid watched Star Wars. There was no Star Wars in 1886.
No television. There was no movies. There was no.
He didn't have a light bulb.
The first talkies, enough talkies. The first silent films weren't even. They're just barely getting off the ground. Barely.
Yeah. So I really focused on that book because I was like, I remember when I read it, I thought, okay, this is probably from like the 50s or something. I don't know.
Right. And
I looked at the preface. I'm like, wait, what? Like when? Because the copy I had was published in 1947 or something. And I was like, but wait, when was this written? 1886? Okay, I'm going to have to spend time on this one. You know,
that's fascinating. All right, so we the one question I asked you before: what's the origin? When did this start? How did Atlantis start?
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, like the original. Were they hunter gatherers? Did they, evolve from monkeys?
Well, Casey actually. Somebody asked him straight up one time, "Did we come from monkeys?" And he said, "Incorrect." Done. That's all he said. He said, "No, we did not." So he rejected Darwinian evolution.
But there's a lot of posters and textbooks already written on that, so we can't go back.
Right. And, Casey does talk about the first, what he calls entanglement of the thought forms in material universe, or in the material of the earth plane, if you will, not in the universe. And he actually puts that at 10.5 million years. And he says, basically at this time, the atmosphere was different and people weren't really like we would think of them now. But over those millions of years, he said by around 200,000 BC, which again is what the anthropological record today suggests, that Homo sapiens emerged kind of like they are today. But he said that he doesn't really talk about the 200,000 to 100,000. Like what was going on then, we don't know. But we know that around 100,000 BC, Casey does talk about the early inklings of kind of circular homes being built on the continent of Atlantis. He does talk about that. And it's not like hunter-gathering, but it's not the high technology of the Frederick Oliver timeline 90,000 years in the future, which, again, these are difficult times for me to think about as a historian, because, think about how much, Alex, has happened in the last 500 years.
The last 100? What are you talking about? Just the last 100?
Yeah.
Where we went from where this kid wrote the book to where we are now.
So what is life going to be like in the year 92,023?
at that point we become energy. I mean, like
they did. Like they did.
Like, let it. Well, that's what something that the Elon Musk said was really interesting. He's like, "Do you think we're in a simulation?" He goes, "Right now, it's inconceivable for us to think that, but we've only had this technology for 100 years. Let's throw 10,000 years, 5,000 years from now. If we just continue to grow our technology in the same pace that we are now, imagine 1,000. He goes, we will within 500 years be able to create a simulation that you will not be able to tell between reality and a simulation. It's just
which
logic.
And it leads you to wonder, has that already happened and are we in it? Or is just the fabric of reality, as Plato suggested? I mean, Plato basically to me already proposed simulation theory with the allegory of the cave.
Of course.
I would argue. I mean that's the basis of the movie The Matrix, but I think it really, people think that, I think that allegory just applied to like the earth plane, but perhaps, I mean, in an age that didn't have computers, Plato really was talking the best he could about what you just said. Like, no, it's not just like in civilization there's certain people that can't see the goodness or the truth. It's like, no, maybe all of this, the entire fabric of reality itself, is like Maya or something like that from the Eastern tradition. So I think it's interesting. And, you know, the sources, they get more specific, because I always tell people, Casey didn't just give these readings for fun. He was a Christian man who gave people past life readings to advance in their own personal development. And so for some reason, most of his readings focused on the final 1,000 years of Atlantis, and the downfall. And a lot of his clients, he claimed, had lived specifically at that time. And he even said that many politicians, because he died during the end of World War II, he died in 1945. He said a lot of the people in this current struggle have come back from that time.
Interesting. Well,
like
that
Hitler
also,
and people like this.
And people have said too, they're like, well, is that, if you want to start getting into the past life situation, where many past life of Atlanteans have come to this time, and that's one of the reasons why our technology has grown.
Absolutely.
Because it makes no sense. We were in the Dark Ages 500 years ago.
Right.
You know, and like, you know, there was just, Rome hung out for about 1,000 years. And they did make some jumps, man, but nothing like we've had in the last 100 years. Nothing in history. The Egyptians hung out for thousands of years. Nothing even remotely close to what we've been able to do in the last 100. So it's, why now? Why is it happening now?
Well, it's interesting because in 1886, Frederick Oliver is talking about that, because he's at least in non-trance life aware of like the technologies developing in 1886. I mean, his world had changed a lot, and he would have been aware of the dynamo and things like this probably. But during his channeling, which is not his voice speaking, it's just him writing, the person channeling through him says America is the new Atlantis, and that many of you have come back now, and that it's your duty to not basically destroy yourselves like you did then, but America is the new Atlantis. It's not literally where it was, which I should be very clear about, but the people, the culture is the same. And he's like, you will face the same challenges, but you will reach the same technological level that Poseid reached in my time 11,000 years ago. And I think, look around, look at Elon, look at Tesla in the 20th century, look at Nikola Tesla, look at all these people that are doing things that even when we were growing up would have seemed fantastical, like a rocket landing. Are you kidding me?
Oh yeah.
Like what? I remember I saw that the first time. I was like, what is this? I thought it was a joke. I thought my friend had sent me a meme. I'm like, what is this? It doesn't even look real.
It does. It does. It actually looks cartoony when it comes back down, like with the little, fake. It looks like the little legs are coming out. Like, that doesn't make sense.
No,
but
there it is. Yeah, there it is. And so I was like, wow. Give, like you said, give that another 100 years.
Well, where are we going to be?
Where are we going to be? You know,
it's remarkable. Now, is there any archaeological evidence anywhere that supports anything dealing with Atlantis or an ancient civilization, but specifically Atlantis?
That's a great question. And, you know, that's a chapter of the book where, I mean, I would argue that the Great Pyramid itself, I would agree actually with what Casey said. Casey said that was built from 10,490 to 10,390 BC. That's the exact date Casey gives. And it's interesting because, again, I'm not sure Casey was versed on the, you know, Egyptian mythology turned papyrus. And when somebody asked him, well, who built it? He said, well, there was an advisor, and then there was the architect. He said there was a man named Ra, and then there was another man named Hermes who built it. And of course, Hermes is Thoth. And it's like, that's what the Egyptians anecdotally say, that Thoth built the damn pyramid in the time after the reign of the demigods. And it's like, okay. And he ruled the land to the west, you know? And as Robert Bauval discovered, those three pyramids are aligned to the constellation Orion, not today, but around the year 10,450. And it's like, he didn't discover that in 1932. He discovered that in 1980. So how did a man, again, Sunday school teacher sitting on a couch, know that Thoth built the pyramids in 10,390 BC? They were completed. How did he know that? I think because he's channeling some lived reality. So I would say the Great Pyramid is a standing megalithic example of Atlantean architecture. How
about Mesoamerica? When did that happen?
Yeah, that's interesting because Casey says that after the second destruction in 28,000 BC, when they overtuned the Firestone crystal and blew up all the substations. So again, another misuse of technology. He says that they started migrations after the second one to the Yucatan. And he said those people eventually became the Maya.
The Aztecs, the Maya, and then there was, of course, in Peru, I forgot
the Inca.
The Inca, yeah, the Incas.
Yeah, and
then the Olmecs. Let's not even get
the
Olmecs.
The Olmecs, yeah. Right. And you know, in Casey even talks about this. I quote this very long, like 3-page transcript, just verbatim, in the book, where somebody asked him. So somebody had the sense to say, we need to get him in a room and ask him very detailed questions specifically about Atlantis. So they told him in Waking Life, hey, we're going to do like an intense only Atlantis in Mesoamerica session. And thank God that was saved, because it's incredible, because he describes how going back even 25,000 BC, that region, you know, where I live now, but particularly towards the Yucatan, had always been a mixture. He's like, it was a mixture of people from Lemuria. It was a mixture of people from Africa. It was a mixture of people from what he calls like the Norwegian lands. It was a mixture of people from Palestine. It was, you know, whatever that was then. And he says it was always a mixture. And he says that's why you're going to find things that look like, you know, Hebrew, like a Star of David, you know, at the Temple of Uxmal, pre-Columbian. You're going to see things that look Egyptian. You're going to see things that look, you know, like they found evidence that there's a connection between pottery in Japan and China and Mesoamerica. And it's like, well, how the hell did they do that? You know, well, it would have been easier if they had this technology, or there was a giant landmass, you know, 5-6 times the size of Australia, where you could sail, you know, because I want to make it clear that it was basically the same world we live in today. Like, we have rockets that can land, but then we have people in the Amazon in canoes. It's not like everybody has access to the highest technology. And Casey and Oliver said that, you know, because when he's flying to India on his cigar-shaped veil, he's like, we're passing over like an island with barbaric people. We're passing over a jungle where the people are looking at us like we're aliens, you know? And he's like, we're just Atlanteans. We are the pride of technology in the ancient world, you know? And then when he gets to India, the culture's advanced but different. He's like, it looks simple, but he's like, these people could kill you with a thought, and they don't need farms because they could just manifest food, you know? So it was like concurrent high, like one went mental, one went material.
Right.
You know? So it wasn't just like,
But that's the way we are right now. But right now,
Exactly.
the West is still material.
Exactly.
And the East is still more mental, more spiritual, more inward bound.
Right.
And then, but there has been a cross-pollination between the two, where now
Just
India,
like back then.
Yeah, India has now it's becoming more material. It's technology, and it's growing as a continent. But when like Yogananda came over in the early 1900s and started talking about yoga and meditation and ascended masters and stuff like that, people were like, what? But that was the seeds that spawned to where we are today. So there's many others as well that did that. So and that's another thing, because a lot of people think that when you hear the story of Atlantis, it's just like the entire world was Atlantis. Like, no, like you said, there were multiple cultures at various stages of development and evolution throughout the world, just like it is today.
I mean, it's astounding, because it must have seemed like a strange story to people living in the 30s, you know, and maybe that's why
it's H.G. Wells. It's H.G. Wells.
It's H.G. Wells, you know, but today I think it's like finally time, and maybe that's just why the book, you know, took form in my mind after seeing that, you know, flying the rocket landing or something. I was like, okay, people could stomach some of these technological discoveries. You know,
but let me ask you though, why do you believe that people have such a difficult time? They have no problem believing that there was a man who is the son of God, who came on, walked on water, did the fish in water, did turn the water into wine, and had all these other things, or believe that there was a prince that found enlightenment underneath of a tree,
right?
And have no problem accepting billions, accept both of those stories will fight to the death,
right,
to defend those stories. But yet any of these other stories are hard to stomach. Why do you believe that?
Well, let me first say that Edgar Cayce would say, and he did say in a transcript, that those were the same people, that the soul that became Jesus was actually like 35 different people, including the Buddha, who just come back in different places to help people, but it's the same person. But yeah, that's a great question, because I've actually asked people that. Like, it doesn't require any kind of leap of faith to believe anything in my book. All it requires is that you suspend the artificial timeline, not based on really any evidence except lack of artifacts, which again would not exist, because this is 12,000 years ago. So anything made of aluminum is not going to last 12,000 years. All you're going to find is megalithic architecture, you know? And I always tell people, like, when people say the Great Pyramid, you know, was built in dynastic Egypt by Khufu, it's like, that itself is a fantasy. It's based on nothing. Yeah. Based on a cartouche that Harold Weiss probably wrote himself. You know,
there is not one hieroglyph in all of Egypt. The tens of thousands of hieroglyphs have been found in Egypt. Right. Not one has them building a pyramid.
No.
Or showing how it was constructed. You would think something that big, because they talked about everything, man.
Right.
And those
but they forgot that. They put Khufu at the top of the King's Chamber just to
the propaganda on their own stuff that they did back in the day. They talked about everything.
Everything.
Except for this big giant megalithic structure, the largest thing ever created on the planet.
Yeah. They forgot that one.
They never mentioned it once.
No.
I mean, you start looking at that kind of evidence, you start going, it just doesn't line up, man. It just doesn't line up. And I want to kind of dig into something you said there, because that's another argument that a lot of people have for Atlantis, or even any advanced, like what Graham Hancock says, any advanced civilizations in past, is that, well, why don't we find the ray gun? Or why don't we find some ship or some artifact?
Sure.
Because if today all humanity left the planet, in 10,000 years, there would be no signs.
Nothing.
Of us.
Oh, of us particularly? The only thing that would exist probably would be like the Hoover Dam, which was megalithically constructed. Maybe that.
And they would be arguing what it was for. Because they wouldn't know. Because they wouldn't know. And maybe there are some other stone or some maybe. And that's a big maybe.
And we don't even have, I know this from an architect friend of mine who says the cement the Romans used, if you can find like that formula, he's like, it's stronger than my cement that I use to build modern buildings. He's like, you know,
it's true. Yeah,
he
yeah.
said that.
Yeah,
he's like, I can't even make a building. Because I asked him, I was watching him pour cement the other day on a construction site. And I was like, how long does that last? He's like, maybe 100 years before you got to do another foundation or a retouch or something like that. And I'm like, oh, that's it? You know, on a modern.
So how's the Colosseum still standing?
Yeah. And he's like, well, because they had a much better cement that we don't even really, they mixed it with some other type of sand. And he's like, I don't even know. But he's like, when I used to visit Italy as an architect, my friend, he's like, I used to look at this building and be like, God, like this is better than our construction techniques today, you know, and that was ancient Rome, you know. So it's like, I think you're absolutely right. And, you know, Edgar Casey's son, I include a great quote from him because he even says this with a tinge of like annoyance, probably from being asked, like, your dad says this and that. And he's like, look, let's say a tidal wave and a cataclysm swept across the United States right now. He goes, and in the year 10,060, a research team comes around, drills a 4-inch hole at the bottom of the ocean. He goes, they're going to find Manhattan. They're going to find a car. He goes, in fact, they would say America never existed at all. It was just that myth that people talked about.
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And he's right.
He's
and you're
absolutely
right. You know?
Well, look, I mean, there's something that they used to call black soil. Did you know about this in Mesoamerica? That they did that. So it was this combination that the Maya used to do, because they were like, because the Amazon was not fertile land back in the day.
Well, hold that thought and continue. But I got to remember something after this. Thank you for telling me this.
So it wasn't fertile land at that point, but they were able to create this soil mixed in with some sort of soot and other things that was so fertile that they could plant it anywhere and it would become fertile land instantly. And they have examples of it, but they just don't understand how it was even created. This is stuff that we're discovering now. And let's not even get to what they burned, what the conquistadors burned in Mayan history.
Well, we're lucky. We are lucky that we just have like that Chilam Bala, like things like that where a nice priest said, I got to put this away. I got to save this one thing, you know,
or whatever's on the walls or whatever's
on the walls. But, you know, it's so interesting, Alex, that you mentioned the ancient art, agriculture, because again, not to just go on about this book, but it shows how powerful these clairvoyant sources are. So in A Dweller on Two Planets from 1886, channeled book, he's talking about coming back from India. And he goes, now we're traveling on our return. They go around the world, just sightseeing. He goes to Utah. He goes to the Tetons. He goes all over. He goes to Lake Superior. He goes to all of these places. And he's like, we're sightseeing over the Amazon right now. Okay. And he says, this is from 1886. He says, you know, you all think that this is a pristine wilderness. And he goes, but it wasn't that way. He goes, we Atlanteans transported most of the crops and plants that you think are wild to the Amazon in my time. Okay. He said that in 1886. Well, 3 years ago, the BBC releases a press release. Team of international scientists shocked to discover that the Amazon has actually been farmed for over 10,000 years, we now know, and probably crisscrossed with irrigation ditches. And it's like, how did a 17-year-old kid in 1886 know that? Unless he was in touch with something we don't really think is real, but we should. And so that's what I do in the book. Anytime a statement is made, I go, here's the source. Or if there is no evidence, hey, there is no evidence. But I was never able to categorically refute anything he said or Casey said about this timeline. It was just more information needed, or bingo. Oh, wow, there is evidence of irrigation in the Amazon 10,000 years ago that we just discovered now, you know?
So are there any modern scientific discoveries or theories that indirectly support or challenge the existence of Atlantis? To be the devil's advocate here.
Sure.
You found.
I'm thinking off the top of my head. I mean, not really, especially not after Gobekli Tepe. I think before Gobekli Tepe, you could make a claim, maybe, and especially not after the discovery in, what is it, in South Pacific, in I believe Indonesia, Borneo, of Gunung Padang, which they
Oh
think is
my God.
20,000 years old, and it's
Yeah,
like,
that thing is insane. I saw it in Ancient Apocalypse.
what's that all about?
Yeah, that's like another
You
whole other
know, I
world.
think
Like,
I think maybe 20 years ago it was. That's why I have such tremendous respect for people like Hancock, who in 1995 was talking about this stuff before Gobekli Tepe and Gunung Padang were even discovered. And so I think it's really difficult today, specifically with Gobekli Tepe. I think that's like, if you still think that there were only hunter gatherers on Earth,
it's not. Come
or
on.
that Gobekli Tepe, I heard somebody say in an article, oh, they were just brewing beer there and they just hung out there. We found evidence that they actually were, it was just a brewery where hunter gatherers came to drink. I'm like,
So that how did
we'll
they
go
lift?
to any extent,
How
we'll
did
go
they
to any
lift
extent. I don't know.
20-ton pieces of what is it, Grant? Whatever the
Well,
damn thing
they
is.
just got drunk, Alex. They got a
That's
couple Bud
true.
Lights
They got a
and
couple Bud
and they
Lights.
built a ramp, just like in Giza, they built a ramp, Alex, that doesn't exist. A
Right.
ramp
And then
that's bigger than the pyramid itself that just disappeared into thin air.
also, by the
Um,
way, also chiseled in really accurate astronomical
yeah,
ideas as
yeah,
well.
more accurate than the Greenwich we use today. We were supposed to actually, it was a conference, believe it or not, around the turn of the century, where they were deciding what's going to be the international time count
Yeah.
meridian, and they were going to pick Giza because they said this is more true than Greenwich. And at the last moment, they said Greenwich. We're going to use the Greenwich Tower or whatever. And again, yeah, they just
Well, so
moved
then
it
also,
on.
right, and then also don't forget the pyramid. The dimensions of the pyramid, if you multiply it by a certain, like the width of the pyramid
Mhm.
is the height of the earth in the
Well,
dimensions or something like that.
the actual scale of the pyramid is an integer. Christopher Dunn discovered this. It's a literal scale model of the weight of the Earth. So,
And the diameter, and the
which,
diameters,
yeah,
and the
right, and it divides the hemispheres, which you need in a tomb, Alex. That's
right.
so important.
Well, they've never found any. There's just never found a body in there, man. They've never found a
No,
body or any.
no,
There's no hieroglyphic. There's no
no.
hieroglyphs inside of the pyramids.
And it leads me, I guess, to kind of conclude this part of the discussion. It's why I spent so much time on like the psychology of the academic world, and not just academia, but any of these journalists from Slate or National Geographic. And there are some good ones, but I point out some cases where it's like all they have is ad hominem attacks and basically counting on your own ignorance of this material,
Mm-hmm.
because I really wanted to give this book to the world to show people, like, look, if you were ever on the fence, like, there are a couple just shut down type arguments you can make, where if somebody said, oh, you believe in Atlantis, and I mean, you could use what you said, like, well, you believe a man walked on water and raised himself from the dead. I'm not saying he did or didn't, but I mean, billions of people believe that. Are they all crazy? Um, we don't even need that kind of leap of faith to just think, well, if modern humans have existed for at least 250,000 years with the same or greater brain capacity as us, why did it take us 193,000 years to learn how to farm?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. Or Edgar Cayce and Frederick Oliver are telling a story that's been lost to us, and we've actually always been advanced or on varying levels of advancement, but that the current level of technology has existed dozens of times through dozens of cultures in dozens of destructions, and that we've always had electricity in different forms. We've always had internet in different forms because physics doesn't change as far as I know. And if the same physics can produce this today, then they could produce it in the past. You know,
Yeah,
we
you
still had
just
the
need the
same
key.
materials. It's the same like sandbox to create. So if we had the same brain 250,000 years ago, what happened?
What's different between that and now?
Yeah, nothing.
Well, that's the question. Like,
Nothing.
why didn't during the Roman times, when there was wealth and power and everything, we didn't make the kind of advances that we did today?
Well, you know, there's a few strange things like, you know, like the Romans knew about steam power, but they only used it for toys, you know? And the ancient Greeks had on temples doors that opened not automatically. You still had to start the machine, but they had steam powered doors on a certain temple, I believe, in Delphi, to make people think the gods were opening the doors. So, and then like Archimedes had inventions that like levering of types of levers that even to this day are incredibly advanced, and cantilevers for that time. But I would argue, and I talk about this, I think, quite a bit in the book, that whatever did exist in terms of that record of that knowledge, whether it was deployed or kept for the priesthood or whatever, I do believe was taken to the Vatican or destroyed outright during the three destructions. One purposeful, the second one, the first, the fire that Julius Caesar started to save Cleopatra's ass from her crazy brother. And then the third, pillaged by, you know, the first Muslims to take over Alexandria. So I think there probably were records of high technology and its use. They're just gone, you know,
or exist in the vault of the Vatican,
or they're in the basement. Yeah, of course they took something. Hey, if they could take an obelisk, you know, from Heliopolis and bring it back to Italy, I'm sure they could take a few boxes of books on like alchemy. I'm sure they have a couple of those down there in the basement, but they won't let me and you down there, so we'll never know.
And one other thing that I've started to come to understand too, you mentioned earlier that the poles started to shift in history. That's something that a lot of people don't grasp the understanding of. Through time, by nature, the poles, the magnetic poles shift, the northern pole.
Sure.
So Antarctica at one point was not frozen. It wasn't a frozen wasteland as it is today. And it, like, perfect example, as they've discovered that the Giza Plateau was once like the Amazon, flourishing.
When they built the pyramid, according to Casey, it was a fertile grassland.
Right, exactly. It wasn't all just desert and ramps. So so other places could have been completely covered in ice, like according to Graham Hancock.
Half of North America was under a 2-mile ice sheet. You know?
Right. That was just covered up. So and it just slowly, there's so much what ifs in this. I mean, you going down this rabbit hole, man, must have been just exciting, and
it was
terrifying.
It was crazy. It was like a nervous breakdown
every day
that I turned into a book, you know, I guess.
Right, because you just go like, no, that can't be it, and then you start connecting the dots here and there. It's like almost like a detective. You're a detective. You're a historical detective.
Yeah, and that's, you know, that's how I was trained. I was trained by some really wonderful, like really intelligent professors who really like pushed me. You know, if I would be doing any investigation, they're like, look, this is great to bring in secondary sources, but like go back to the originals with anything. Even in my traditional study of the Enlightenment, like go back to a letter Thomas Jefferson wrote to his friend in Paris and like read it and really see what he said. Don't just read a critique of it or an article. Like you could come up with a new idea, you know. And I never forgot, that's really how historians should do it. And that's why I had to go back and read A Dweller on Two Planets 10 times, probably the only person on earth, and sit there like a weirdo and read 500 channeled transcripts from Edgar Casey from the archives of the ARE, because it's not enough to just read a book on this is what Edgar Casey said about Atlantis. Because I'll be honest with you, a lot of those authors didn't do a close reading. You know, they did a great job of, hey, look, here's in general what he said. But I think, to be honest, this is one of the most detailed, like meticulous studies of how clairvoyant evidence lines up with quote unquote hard science, you know, that I have seen, because that's what I was trying to do.
In your opinion, what is the most important unanswered question about Atlantis?
Oof. Does the Hall of Records, as Casey and others have said, exist? And if so, will we?
The physical one you're
Yes,
talking about?
right. Because Casey said, famously there was one of them, one repository was under the Sphinx, between the Sphinx and the Nile River.
Right.
And if that is indeed true, we would probably have to take years, just like we did with the Dead Sea Scrolls, to translate it. But if that is indeed true, and you could see like a preserved, Casey says there's like musical instruments and things like this made out of orichalcum, which is a famous metal that Plato mentioned. If we could find something like that had like even perhaps like a crystal hard drive that could be like accessed, like
Can you imagine?
like welcome to Atlantis.
Very Krypton, very Krypton like.
Well, but it's like I've always wondered, like, most of what Casey said I found to be pretty accurate. So when he said that there is a Hall of Records that is protected by an electrostatic energetic barrier that cannot be passed until humanity evolves to that frequency, it will kill anybody that tries to enter the chamber. Well, perhaps it has been discovered to be lethal to that team, perhaps, that entered it. It's not impossible that Zahi Hawass and friends have been aware of that and maybe got close to it and realized, like, oh my God, there is an electrostatic or some sort of frequency barrier, which is a technology. It's not mystical. It's a technology. And if that were the case, I think that is a really fascinating mystery, the search for the Hall of Records. And, but again, it's like, because they'll predictively program you with an Indiana Jones movie or something, like the Crystal Skull. It's like, oh, you think you're going to find a crystal skull? And it's like, well, crystal skulls have been found, some fake, some real, but the real ones we can't explain. So which came first, a crystal skull or Indiana Jones? Like, oh, that book you wrote sounds like Star Wars. Well, which came first, a channeled book in 1886 or Star Wars: A New Hope in 1977? Like, let's be honest, man. I think that we're on to something.
Well, I do have to say that the new Indiana Jones is fantastic. So,
okay.
It was a lot of fun.
I don't watch much of those anymore. I don't watch.
The brand new one just came out. So much fun.
Okay.
You have to watch it when it comes out.
He's still going. How old is Indiana Jones in this one?
He's
gotta be like 70.
He's 80, 81. He's actually, in real life, I think he's like 81, 82.
Wow.
He's like in his late 70s in the movie, and they address it very clearly. What's going on? They're just like,
okay.
But it's a lot of fun. Anyway, all right, I'm going to ask you a few questions. I ask all my guests, because I could keep talking to you about Atlantis for another 5 hours.
Sure, we've already gone a long time. Gone over time.
So we can keep going. But these are a couple questions I ask all my guests. What is your definition of living a fulfilled life?
Doing what you love every day.
If you had a chance to go back in time and talk to little Michael, what advice would you give him?
Keep going. You're not crazy.
How do you define God?
However you want to.
And what is the ultimate purpose of life?
To ask what the ultimate purpose of life is.
And hopefully get an answer. Hopefully.
I don't know if that's possible, Alex. I can't answer that question right now, Alex. I'm still looking.
And where can people find out more about you, your book, and the work that you're doing, sir?
You could go to my website, Michael Le Flem, last name one word.com. And there's a link to the book, and you can find the book on Amazon. And it's also actually available now. I translated it into Spanish under Visiones de la Atlántida. So you can find it in Spanish as well on Amazon in English, and as an audiobook and Kindle and things like that.
There's an audiobook?
Yeah, there's an audiobook, and actually right now working on the audiobook in Spanish with the guy. So
that's awesome.
All format. You got no excuse. You can read it in any format or listen to it. So,
and what is your parting message to the audience about the history of Atlantis?
Just keep an open mind. You'd be really surprised what we don't know, and that's why I think I opened the book with my parting quote here, Alex, which is from Socrates. I'm the wisest man alive, because I know one thing, and that's that I know nothing, and it's the tone of the book, and it's the tone of how I operate. And I think true knowledge cannot be anything more than the search, for the search is indeed the objective when you're coming to a subject like this. Who are we to say exactly where, what, how this civilization existed? All we can say is it looks to be the case that there was something, and it's not just a myth.
Michael, it has been a pleasure chatting with you, man, about Atlantis. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and I appreciate you and what you're trying to do for the world, my friend. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Alex. It's been a great time.
Thanks for watching. Click on one of the videos below to continue your journey, and don't forget to subscribe.